Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are on the globe, on the planet. Welcome to snack time. And snack time is taking the form of a lunch and learn today. So very, very happy for those folks who are joining us, for Virginia-Highland Church friends, members, family, neighbors, for those who are new and just kind of finding out about Virginia-Highland Church. Welcome. We're so glad to have you. We are recording this Lunch and Learn, and we will have a copy of it on our Facebook page. So if you know someone who's not able to make it, just tell them to check our Facebook page and they can catch the replay. My name is Leah Allen, and I have the pleasure of serving as Minister of Faith and Justice here at Virginia-Highland Church. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia, and we are a progressive community of faith that welcomes and affirms and explores and expands the gift of LGBTQ plus people in God's church. And today we are kicking off this Lunch and Learn on gender identity. And we have with us one of my really good friends and just an all around outstanding human being and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, particularly in the church, Myles Markham. Myles is someone who you may have seen before, Virginia-Highland Church. Myles is not a stranger to us, but we're delighted to welcome him back and to be able to host this Lunch and Learn in this virtual space. You are all muted, and I want to encourage you that as you engage, to please feel free to type in the chat. There will be time for question and response from Myles later on in this portion, but I invite you to say hello, use the reaction emojis to kind of get engaged in the conversation. So Myles, do you want to maybe briefly introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I have met some people on this call before, but it is good to be with you again, even if just virtually. I guess the main things I will start out by saying is I am Myles, like Leah said. I use pronouns he, him, or they, them. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as this conversation continues. I lived in Atlanta for 7 years, but recently moved to Los Angeles. And so I am now based out here in California. I just graduated from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur. And I work for two different entities. One of my jobs is with the PCUSA, which is another progressive mainline denomination. And I work specifically in their disaster response ministry area. And then my second role is with a company called Multitude Films, and that is an independent documentary company, and I work as what they call an impact producer for them. And so I'm sort of the middle person between where issue-based films meet community organizing and advocacy. So those are my two jobs, but I am here today as a Bible nerd and transgender person. So yeah, anything else, feel free to ask about, and I'll be happy to share.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Myles, for joining us. So I just want to start off by asking you, how do you identify? And for you to have space to name all the ways that you identify.
Sure. So like I just mentioned, I do identify as transgender. And more specifically, I identify as transmasculine and non-binary. I would use the word queer to describe my sexual and romantic orientation. we can talk about that if there are questions. I am multiracial and multi-ethnic, meaning that I connect with my native Hawaiian, Japanese, American, Swedish, and German lineages as distinct and yet integrated. And I identify as Christian. That comes with a few caveats, but it is nevertheless a salient identity that I continue to maintain.
I like that. Christian with caveats.
Yes.
Very good. So Myles, what, if anything, has your gender identity as a transgender non-binary Christian using he, him, and they, them pronouns, what has that lived experience taught you about God? Or, is it a significant part of your own spiritual journey?
Definitely. I could talk about a few different ways this is true, but I'm actually just going to name one for the sake of this conversation. And that is that one thing my gender identity has taught me about God is how God cares about and loves our bodies. And God loves our bodies and cares about them, not despite, but because of what makes them unique. So what I mean by that is, in my own experience, because I am trans, it is not uncommon for many people to assume this means that I have had a lifelong problem with my body. And while this is certainly how some trans people do describe their experiences, it shouldn't be taken as the only story. For me, my problem wasn't with my body. My problem was with how I was taught to think about bodies, my own and other people's. I grew up in a kind of Christianity that taught us that the spirit is good and the flesh is bad. Our bodies were all corrupt with sin. And while never explicit, most of the teachings implied that the closer a person was to being able to fall neatly inside certain boxes, whether those be around gender or race, then the better your interpretation of the Bible would be, the more objective your opinion could be about truth, and the more trustworthy you would be as a messenger or as a teacher. And so because my body wasn't exactly white and wasn't exactly cisgender and certainly was not heterosexual, I tried to become what they told me to be. And that was a good and pure Christian woman. I tried to change to fit inside that kind of box, which meant I needed to actively hate or at least ignore and never think about my body. And to never think about my race or my gender or my sexuality was what it meant to be godly. And I'm certain that if I would have continued in that trajectory, it would have killed me. And eventually things got so bleak for me that I knew I had to seek out other perspectives. I had to search out more about my ethnicities, about gender, and about sexual diversity. And very slowly, I began to see and feel that, contrary to what I was taught for so long, God did not see my body and all of its particularities as a problem at all. And so to confirm my gender identity wouldn't be a means to abolish my body. It was a way to embrace it because God had already said that it was good and it was true and it was lovable. I could begin to believe those things about myself as well. And so changing my body was not an act of hate. It was an act of love. To confirm my gender identity was a way for me to express communally who God had made me to be. And from there on, my body wouldn't just be a place I could finally feel at home, but it could be a sign and a symbol of God's work of healing and liberation in the world. So yeah, that's a longer answer, but I would say that that is one of the most important things that I believe my gender identity has taught me about God.
Wow, that's powerful. And I appreciate you giving us really just a tidbit of your testimony and experience in some churches. I wonder what what story or stories in the Bible have maybe like inspired you along your gender journey, or helped you to explore your gender and even embrace it. You mentioned that you got a lot of healing out of really just kind of a change in theology and questioning what you were taught about yourself or told to believe about your body. So are there any stories that you resonate with in the scriptures?
Yeah, definitely. I know that up top, it feels important to say that not unlike other people in communities that have had the Bible weaponized against them, I engage scripture, I think, from a place of caution. And so while I do love the Bible, I also feel it's always important to note that I'm never asking other people to feel the same way about it, especially other trans, gender nonconforming, and gender expansive people. So that's the first thing I want to say about that. But with that kind of stated, I do think that scripture has a lot to show and to teach us about gender identity. While not explicitly, it is to me something that presents itself thematically. And one of those things is around name change. So scripture is filled with stories of people who have changed their name, as well as stories of people who have changed the name by which they call God. So in the Bible, Jacob becomes Israel. Hagar goes from calling God Yahweh or Elohim and begins using El Roy instead. Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, Simon becomes Peter, Saul becomes Paul. All of these examples, you see name change kind of ranging from proclaiming who one is to become in the future, like an aspirational identity, or simply recognizing and confirming who a person has always been, their truest, essence, I guess you could say, or it can be a combination of the two. And this set a kind of precedent for me to think about how name change could function in my own life, especially along the lines of gender identity. And I think I could say a lot more about that if people are interested. But the second thing I was going to lift up was something that the New Testament in particular, the epistles talk about, and that is the theme of resurrection. I know that for churches who observe a liturgical calendar, we are still in Lent, and so maybe I'm moving a little too fast to jump to Easter here, but I don't think there's any spoilers here for anybody who's been around church long enough, so I'll go ahead and continue to talk about resurrection. And as it pertains to the letters we read to the Romans, to the Corinthians, to the Thessalonians, metaphors for resurrection include rebirth. There are descriptions of something they call the old man and the new man. And there are comparisons in contrast of those different identities. And most of them are connected to how salvation is both now and it is somehow not yet. It is here and it is out there. You have a body now, and later you'll have another body, or at least another way of thinking about the body that you have. For years, I accepted this idea as pretty integral to how I understood my faith and how I understood myself spiritually. And at some point, I began to wonder why I was so afraid of letting that idea apply to my gender identity as well. So the both and or neither, framework for resurrection ended up being a really great tool for me to have in my worldview. And I credit a lot of that to the years, I'd spent thinking about that as a spiritual part of my spiritual walk. And the last thing I'll say is that apart from explicit themes or texts in scripture, the Bible lends itself to gender exploration to me in that, like scripture, gender is not one thing. It is and has been interpreted differently across time and space, language and culture. And it's in this dynamism that makes it trustworthy, that makes it timeless, that makes it something that can represent a God who is big and incomprehensible, and nevertheless, we're told is knowable. I think our genders are pretty similar in that way. And I encourage any person, whether they have some latent transness or not in themselves, to be open to that kind of internal movement, because you never know what you could find and what sort of freedom comes with those kinds of discoveries. So yeah, that's it.
Wow. Yeah, I really appreciate you tying that in and kind of explaining a new way of seeing, yet another way of seeing and understanding resurrection. Speaking of, talking about latent transness, and I know there are probably allies gathered here as well, or watching on Facebook. What we consider Virginia-Highland Church, we consider to be a progressive community of faith, which I talked about a little bit in the welcome. But what do you think are next steps that churches like ours could be taking, or folks who consider themselves like allies? What are some things that you might recommend for like a progressive folks to kind of do to further supporting trans and gender expansive folks like ourselves?
Sure. I think in many ways, Virginia-Highlands already kind of does a lot of great things. And so a part of what I might share here is already represented, I think, in the spirit and the culture of the church there. But if not, I think I will start with this first thing, and it's just recognizing that when we're talking about trans and gender expansive people, we are already there among the church, right? So it's not just about people who are out, and, people who are vocal about being gender expansive, but there's so many other people likely in your church who maybe don't have the right language yet to talk about themselves, something that's always been true about them, or maybe they don't feel safe to come out to themselves. much more, an entire community of people. And it's even possible that they never do, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And so I think there are ways that progressive congregations can set themselves up to be proactive. So instead of waiting until somebody comes out to you and asks for resources, and then you just, for example, send them to you, Leah, that the entire congregation can be involved in creating a space of hospitality. So there's not just one expert or one person involved in the ministry of the church who can be representative, of the inclusive ethos, of any given community. The second thing I'll say is that there are actually quite a few resources out there with tips and suggestions about how to make your congregation a place that's truly inclusive of trans, gender expansive, gender nonconforming people. And I can prepare my short list of those, and you can send those out to folks who are interested in that sort of thing. But the one thing I'll say right now along those lines is how important it is for progressive congregations to do outreach and public witness around trans and gender issues. I don't know, well, one, how many people on this particular call are based in Atlanta, but this is true for cities around the country. But right now, there are so many anti-trans bills in city and state legislatures, and having congregations and Christians in particular speak out against those goes such a long way in changing hearts and minds in society. It's one thing for clergy to show up and do this, but it becomes an entirely different thing when people who aren't professional ministers decide to get themselves involved. And along similar lines, again, I know this is true of Atlanta, but it's also true of other cities around the country. But there are a handful of trans-focused organizations in and around the city, and for congregations to actively reach out to those organizations in the name of partnership and the intention to collaborate, to express support, to express solidarity, it goes such a long way. Explicitly asking these organizations, hey, like, what do you need? Or how can we be of service or of support to what you're doing? I think that is a wonderful way for progressive congregations to show up for trans and gender expansive people.
Excellent. That's good stuff there. Yeah, I be happy to share a few resources that you have with folks after this lunch and learn. I want to just pause for a moment and remind folks that we've got the chat box if you'd like to engage that way and ask a question, but there will be time for question and response with Myles. But feel free to engage or send a little emoji. Sometimes I like to send like hearts or the clapping hands, and you say something real good. Those are all there for you to use as well. I wonder if we could shift briefly before opening it up to conversation with the community. And I'm kind of blend two questions or two thoughts. You and I have talked offline just about what we wish cisgender people understood about transgender folks and gender expansive folks, and not to berate or belittle them, but more so to invite an opportunity to really get to know trans, gender expansive, and gender nonconforming people a little bit better, because we're all part of God's family too. So, but I want to blend that kind of thought with a conversation that you and I have had around children. And we know that in the news right now, there's a lot of talk around transgender kids in sports, transgender kids being getting access to or being denied access to things for medical transition if they choose to do that. What are your thoughts on this? Because I feel like this is something that cisgender people could really take a hard look at and can maybe start to think a little bit more broadly, about support that trans folks need. What are your thoughts on that, particularly around this issue of children, trans kids?
Sure. Yeah. I think what's important to note upfront for people is that children get used in a lot of our political, and just maybe social discourse more broadly. It's the quickest way to incite fear or sympathy. And so to me, it is not surprising that a lot of that anti-trans legislation I mentioned specifically targets trans children and trans youth. So I think that is just very critical to note up front, is that it is a part of a bigger problem we have socially, is to focus all of our conversations in that direction because of its affect. But with that noted, I think the other thing I'll say too is that in general, one of the ways we're socialized is around how we think about age and how we think about what it means to be an adult, what it means to be a youth, what it means to be a child. And a part of that socialization is to distrust and to discredit children. So when a child tells us something about themselves, our first instinct is to think like, well, like, that's cute, or this is a phase, or there's no way that that's actually true of this person because they're too young to know that about themselves. And so I think that we have to really try to resist that notion, because I think all of us as adults have things that are true about us now that were true about us from our earliest memories. And all of the psychology and the other social sciences are pointing toward how gender identity is formed very early for us. And it's not that it doesn't change, and it's not that it isn't fluid or anything like that. It just means that we began collecting that data and those, kind of knowings about ourselves when we're very young. And so the first thing I think could be a good lesson, for folks is around this idea that we should believe young people when they tell us that something's true about them. The second thing I would say is that a lot of how I call them like trans myths, float around, in the headlines are around medical interventions and about confirming gender identity and what that means and what that looks like. And there is a lot of misinformation out there about how that happens, specifically for trans young people. And so what I love to point people toward is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, is a organization that exists for education, research, and advocacy for trans, gender expansive, and gender nonconforming people. And from its inception, there was a kind of charter created called the Standards of Care. And it specifically outlines how medical professionals should relate to trans people, including trans youth, which is not about ever pushing anybody in one particular direction or another. It is about creating the conditions for the safest exploration possible. And so that's the other thing I would say about kids is I've heard a lot of really crass language about things like hormone replacement therapy, things like gender affirming surgeries, and so on and so forth. And there is this notion that a person can just like roll up to the doctor's office and have access, to whatever they want, but it doesn't work like that. And there are a lot of, frankly, barriers to entry in that way, which is true of all healthcare, I think, in the US, which is a different conversation. But in as far as gender identity and gender identity of youth is concerned, the two things I guess I would love for people to walk away with is one, that it is so important and valuable to believe and to trust young people. And then the second thing is to acknowledge that there is a lot of thought and care, intention, and research that has gone into developing the right interventions and therapies for trans and gender expansive people.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for touching on that. I figured it might be interesting for people to hear because it is so talked about, and you're right. I agree with you that the ways in which youth are used, children are used as a talking point is really sad, but also that there's just a general disbelief on many things that we don't necessarily believe children about, and that disbelief can lead to harm. So
Right.
thank you for lifting that up, and also the resource around WPATH, Standards of Care for Transgender Persons. So I want to pause here, and if it's all right with you, Matt and Myles, I'm going to unmute folks. I'm going to pause our recording. Wow. Yep. Excellent. Thank you. And thanks, Tariku, for the question. There's a question from MJ in the chat. And it was, has your gender identity of God changed on your journey? Has your gender identity of God changed on your journey? If so, how?
Is that question like, how do I think about God's gender? Or is
I think so. MJ, if you'd like to unmute, you're welcome to.
Yeah, basically that's it. I've had a couple of friends who, God's always sometimes used as the he, him pronoun. And as they've gone on their journey, it seems their own view of God has changed to them, they. Have you gone on a very similar journey yourself?
Yes and no. So I, as a little person, when I came to believe in God, I would say that God did not have a gender, even though I was using he, him pronouns for God, because that was what was true of the Bible I was reading. It was true of all of the Christian communities I had access to. There was never a part of me that thought God has a gender and it's obviously male. And so in that way, I think my starting point was a little different than some people who are presented a very explicit and clear male version and male expression of God. So I think that changed things for me personally. But in general, I think as a non-binary person who feels comfortable with all pronouns, there's no pronoun a person could use for me as long as they're not being mean. That wouldn't work. I have a deep and personal connection to being able to use different pronouns and it not cut me off from God's other expressions in the world. And so I'm very comfortable, and I resonate with what I guess could be considered like feminine metaphors, for God, thinking about God as a mother or grandmother or anything else, in that sort of lexicon. I'm also comfortable with refraining from gender altogether when it comes to thinking about God too. And so I wouldn't say that my journey was marked in as far as God's gender changing. I just don't think God has gender, although I do think gender can be a helpful way of talking about God, because that's how we talk about beings in this world. But it wasn't very significant for me to have to make some shifts. I do appreciate when I see churches and I see people doing work to understand God in the feminine, specifically because that most explicitly challenges the patriarchal kind of overtones that most of Christian history has used to talk about God. And one way I've heard somebody put it is that the solution to gender hierarchical ways of thinking about men and manhood is not it's not egalitarianism. Like that is a helpful frame of reference to move toward, but the opposite of that is feminism, right? So you don't challenge patriarchy with egalitarianism, you challenge patriarchy with feminism. And so to me, that is a way I've actively tried to kind of unlearn and recondition my mind, is to be especially interested in the divine feminine, because of how long and deeply entrenched misogyny is in the Christian tradition.
MJ signing, thank you. Thanks for the question too, MJ. Kate, I want to come to you if you want to unmute. I saw you raised your hand earlier. Hey, Kate, are you there? Okay, I'm gonna come back to Kate and figure out in the chat. Oh no, okay. Kate said apparently the microphone isn't working again. Kate, feel free to drop it in the chat, and because I want to get to your question. Sorry about the technical issues. Okay. So there was a question from Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Thanks, Leah. Myles, you're amazing, like a incredible teacher. I feel like I want to take any class that you would give, but I have a question because I do am a teacher, and I was just trying to think of this in a really different way. When you were talking about how congregations like VHC could be more welcoming, and if people have questions, not just funnel them to Leah, but for everyone to be an ambassador, it made me think about how incredibly welcoming the whole congregation is to my son, Tariku, who asked you some questions earlier, who has cognitive differences, but is treated as a full human being in all respects as he is. And he is himself, and he does what he does. And it's so embracing and not something I expected. So I love VHC for that. But anyway, that's my preamble in thinking. When I work, I'm at Oglethorpe, and I get lots of freshmen who come through, and college I know is a time where you could suddenly find yourself not as constrained by your parents and maybe suddenly exploring, and it's a really vulnerable and key time, right? So I know there's more that we can all do who are right there with those youth, like one thing is on Zooms, making sure you click that little button that lets people indicate their pronouns, like other really practical steps. And there's more, what do you wish that you had seen when you went to school that would have widened that welcome, where it wasn't like you got a pipeline, if you really need help, here are the extremely hard steps, but instead it was like, here. what are some things we can all do?
Yeah, that is a really great question, and I appreciate you asking. I think I right now am picturing my niece, who is 9, and before she went to kindergarten, she had a really precious way of interacting with me around gender. And in these unsolicited conversations, she, as a 4-year-old, would say, "Oh, Grammy is a girl, mommy is a girl, daddy's a boy." And I would say, "What am I?" And she would say, "A people." And it was just like a very simple way of being able to acknowledge, like, oh, there's more than boy and girl here. Now, I share that to contrast it with what happened when she went to kindergarten, because once she entered into school, all of a sudden her world became extremely binary, extremely, blue and pink, to kind of use that metaphor. And I think that school in this way is one of the uh, biggest ways we began to become what I call the gender police. And there is a lot of social rewards, and I would say punishment, for conforming to gender expectations. And so I think in a classroom, whether that is for young people or it's for college students, I've seen this true. I struggle with this at the gym I go to, and it's the ways so far beyond bathrooms that people talk about gender and think about gender. And they're in a choir, for example, there are men sing this, women sing this. When it comes to particular vocal ranges, when I'm at the gym, it's like a recommended weight, for men, recommended weight for women. At school, it's all of this. Oh, this is only for guys, this is only for girls, this is, and what that means. And I think that in as far as kind of going beyond that, it's working to create environments and opportunities for people that aren't so gendered in that way. And I think that there's something to be said for affinity spaces, right? Like when you have shared likeness or shared experiences, it is very valuable to be with people at different times where that is true for them and only for them. But I just think that's not how people are coming at all of the gender segregation that we do in society, at least for the most part. And I think having activities, for people to think and to reflect and not to mock gender exploration is huge. I know one thing I really appreciated, you mentioned pronouns. At my seminary was I had a class where the professor, in the name, of creating a more inclusive space, would ask people to share their name, share their pronouns. But initially, there was no explanation around why we were doing this. And so some people laughed, and made some jokes, not because they were malicious, not because they had, any ill will, but because they just had never done that before and nobody ever introduced them to the idea. And so the professor went on, the next time we did that exercise, to describe why that was important. And another thing I really appreciated that she did was she didn't put it on the trans, and gender expansive people to be the reason why we were doing that. It wasn't to like coddle us, it wasn't because we're so fragile and we need somebody, to do, that kind of presentation for us. It was because she recognized that she has a gender identity, she has a gender expression, and she appreciates it when that's affirmed. And so I really like that. And I think the other thing I would say too is that there is a way that whether a person be an administrator, a professor, or anybody setting up teaching, can participate in like creating inclusive space that just acknowledges how many different ways, gender functions. And I think just being curious about that for people. So I think about, again, my niece in like her classroom, one thing, she was saying to me was like, at first she's like, why do you cut your hair? Girls don't have short hair. And I would like name girls and women in her life, that had short hair. And she's like, I guess you're right. I guess you're right. And so I think being like offering alternative perspectives when you hear people making gendered statements like can be invitational, and I think can help people kind of reflect on the different ways that their masculinities and femininities, are all at play in the world, and just normalizing, gender discussion is great across the board. And yeah.
I want to tell you, one of the things that I've done that I do every semester, I've done this for a long time, but as a queer person myself, but is to pick apart the blue pink thing.
Yeah.
And just poke a big hole in that right away, because I'm talking about art. So I say, let's talk about color. And
Yes.
let's talk about in the 17th century, when pink was considered a very virulent, strong masculine color,
Right.
a woman wouldn't be caught dead wearing. And everyone that wanted to get married wore blue and green,
Yes.
so white wedding dresses, so like all of these things are social constructs.
Right.
So I try to come at it from color and from history, because if people love to have historical precedent in order to oppress others. So right back at you, not really, But I mean, doing that in one context, I realize there's so much more that can be done.
Right.
And what I see, like just the pronoun issue across the entire university now, which is amazing. Like a person will give a talk at Oglethorpe and they will change their pronoun. They'll talk about it in a preamble, like the thing you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
It's starting to become just a normal course of things that happen, not some kind of special treatment or whatever. But anyway, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that really insightful question, bringing your own kind of experience to it. Myles, one way that you framed it, I think, as we've talked, like it is about normalizing gender and gender discussions. So not to trivialize it, but to at least acknowledge that, there are questions about gender. And, I shared with you about coming out to myself a few years ago and realizing that cisgender people don't think about gender and how that blew my mind. And I realized, oh boy, okay, I'm I'm exploring something that other people can't necessarily relate to. But I think by normalizing gender, we have an opportunity for folks who have never really thought about their own gender to think about it, right? Not to try to put yourself in our shoes, but at least to try to interrogate some of the stereotypes and beliefs and ideas that you have about, your own gender. That's a great way to be an ally as well. So Matt, I want to pass it to you. You had a question for Myles, and then if there are other questions, please don't hesitate to like email me directly, and I'll get them to Myles, and we'll see if he'll take an attempt to answer those. We'll be wrapping up in about 4 minutes here, but I just want to say thank you for those of you who have stayed and joined this conversation. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Leah, and thank you, Myles. I'll try to make my question short. I appreciate, it's just a statement, really. I appreciate how our language is transitioning, right? And that the words and phrases we're using today around non-binary, gender expansive, those were not, I don't remember those even a few years ago, 5 or 10 years ago. I don't think those were really in play, and now they are. And just by using gender expansive, we're already beginning to open a conversation about, well, then what do we mean by male? And what do we mean by female? And how do we know what that is? And how does it operate in us and in the world? Which is a really important moment. I mean, when I was studying gender and queer theology 20 years ago, it was just a completely different conversation. And I remember pushback against a trans presenter that we had in our class of, well, it seems like you are reinforcing, this was a trans woman, you are reinforcing gender stereotypes by appearing and presenting as very feminine. And anyway, it just raised a lot of conversation even back then, but now it's, I think, really coming to fore in a more healthy way. But there's lots of places where it's not so healthy. I actually haunt sometimes some very conservative spaces online, and Mr. Potato Head really opened this up and really blew up conservative media in so many ways. And I would just like to hear you reflect on the whole Mr. Potato Head moment.
Yeah. For anybody who's not familiar with this recent headline, basically the toy company decided, like, wow, we don't have to gender these potatoes in the ways that we historically have. And so we'll just, like, they're all just potato people. And that's the whole gag, is that these are potatoes that we are putting eyes and hats and shoes. We're giving gender expression to. And conservative media did not like that, because the problem was that the toy company was acknowledging that gender identity, gender expression are real and valid, and people can be open and explorative of that if they want to be. So yeah, I think the main thing I would say, though, is that what that exposed to me is how much fear, stress, and anxiety exist around gender for people. And again, I kind of alluded to this previously, but whenever we have conversations about sexuality or gender or race, like any of the ways in which we identify, everybody has skin in the game, so to speak. We all have a particular relationship to all of these different categories. And I think especially because of the fact of oppression and marginalization in the world, there are ways that we're always connected to power and privilege when it comes to those identities. And so with gender, you tell somebody, well, it's not quite what you think it is, or there's more to it than just what you can see. All of a sudden that blows up their categories and their worldview and the ways that they felt secure or confident in their place in the world. And so what this makes me think of is my own relationship with my parents. To tell my parents that I was transgender was very hard for them, not because they haven't observed, gender explorative and gender expansive expression in me my entire life, but because so much of their own identity is connected to my identity. And so when I bring them new information about myself, it creates a sense of insecurity in their identities that they hold about themselves. And so I think that that's why what we saw happen with the potato head situation played out the way it did, was it really scared a lot of people to have to really begin to grapple with gender. And the other thing I'll say related to that is there trans, gender expansive, gender diverse people across the board are not saying gender's not real. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as men and women. Some people are saying that, so I'm not going to sit here and say that nobody is saying that. Some people do say that. But I would say that a larger consensus is yes, male, female, men, women, these polarities exist, but there is just between those a lot and beyond those a lot. And we don't even have to think about it like a continuum. I think about it more like a constellation or like a kaleidoscope. I think the best thing we can do is just acknowledge that this is not a new phenomena. It's not a recent phenomena. Gender diversity has existed and been recorded in every civilization that we have record of. It's just often been religion or colonialism that taught us to police that or to enforce rules around it. And so I think that that's where the stress came from. And again, a lot of the conservative rhetoric has been written to establish, or at least to maintain, the fear and the anxiety that anybody has, about gender and gender identity. And the best thing we can do is, I think, I guess, work to try and mitigate those fears and concerns, and work to try and scale back, the emergency, that's created around it, and de-escalate. That's the word I'm looking for. Just de-escalate the fear and the stress that so many people bring to gender conversations and gender identity.
Thank you. Incidentally, potatoes are non-binary as a vegetable, so that's
wow. It's all over nature, really.
I was going to say, I'm just happy to live in a world where potatoes don't have to be gendered anymore. It's great. Tariku, I see you have a question. We're a little bit over time. Myles, can you hang on a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Tariku, do you want to unmute?
Yes, yes. My question is, Myles, if God says to your wife that says, well, my mom said, and told her mom said that she had a dream that she's going to be pregnant and to another child. So if God makes you a dream, says you're having a baby and if your baby is gender, how will you pronounce that to church? How will you pronounce that?
You're asking Tariku about like a gender announcement, like saying the baby's gender, or is there something else you're asking?
No, that's it. That's it.
So I've read a lot of stories over the past couple of years about gender reveal parties, and I've had many friends who've also carried out these celebrations. And in general, I have found that one of the most important things I can do as a friend to people who are having and raising children is to not comment on their style of parenting. Even if I disagree with anything they're doing to present their children to the world or to talk about their children, I recognize that as a place that is not mine to have opinions about. So that's the first thing I'll say. But I guess personally, if I were to have a child, or there were to be a child in my family, and I was going to announce that to the world, I think there are non-gender ways you can talk about a baby and a baby coming into this world. And one thing I love is even some of my conservative friends who actually work in birthing communities, whether that is as a nurse practitioner, as a midwife, as an OBGYN, is they themselves, when they've had kids, decided to not learn what the sex of the baby is. And so what that does is it takes away the expectations a community starts to build around gender. And so it changes, for example, the gifts that people buy for that baby. It changes the way that they think about the baby. I know I've seen, little babies who have like bows and earrings, and they're like, 10 months old. And one of the reasons people do that is because people see the baby and then assume the baby's gender, and then they think that that's wrong. And so then they try to correct it and show that the baby is a girl, or show that the baby is a boy. But really, like, why does it matter, right? Like these are usually infants, and I don't think it like people do that because they want to know, how should I treat this child? And should I treat them like a boy, or should I treat them like a girl? And either way, I think those are very limited ways of learning how to interact with a child. And so in general, I don't love a gender reveal party because I think it sets up expectations for a young person's life that are unfair, either way, no matter who they turn out to be in the world. And it reinforces so many of these other things, that we've talked about on this call about, the rules and the boxes that people have to, follow or fit into. So yeah, I just stay away. No gender, you don't know the baby's gender. The baby doesn't know their own gender. Like, you don't have to pick one, you can just let that little person show up in the world and tell you who they are.
Thank you, Tariku, for the question. And Elizabeth dropped into the chat about, a whole conversation around intersex folk. There are some resources out there for that too. And Myles, I just appreciate the time and the resources that you've brought, and including your lived experience, which is wisdom, which is a resource as well, that you draw from. I really appreciate everyone who's been able to join us on Zoom or on Facebook, and to engage in what I think is a really relevant conversation for the church, but for all people, as we try to lean into inclusion in a more authentic way, around trans and gender expansive Christians and all of God's beloved children. So thank you again, Myles, so much for being here. I think you got some love too on Facebook, and I know there are some folks who wish they could attend, but they'll be able to watch this replay. I appreciate you being with us. I know it's early on the West Coast. So thanks for the time, and thank you all, Virginia-Highland Church family and friends. Hope to see you on an upcoming Lunch and Learn. We've got Holy Week. Of course, you see all those invites in your mail or online about our offerings this week. And following that, we'll actually be having a Lunch and Learn on April 11th. And it's around a film called Coded Bias. And that is talking about race, gender, and AI technology. It's going to be awesome, very thought-provoking. So I hope you'll join us for that Lunch and Learn as well.